The Girl Who Touched the Mafia Heir's Heart Chapter 1. The table no one could please. The city was never quiet at night. Beneath the hum of traffic and the faint whisper of jazz spilling from expensive restaurants, something deeper always moved, the pulse of power. In one corner of the city, behind mirrored glass and guarded gates, stood the Rossi mansion. To the world, it was a symbol of wealth and class. But inside, it carried a silence that even music could not fill. The Rossi family ruled a world where money spoke and fear obeyed. Leonardo Rossi, the father, had built an empire from the ground up, his hands once dirty, now hidden behind silk suits. But the true mystery was his only son, Adrian Rossi, the heir everyone whispered about but no one truly knew. Adrian was a man people didn't look in the eye. Cold, calm, and distant, like a statue carved from the marble floors he walked on. Servants would bow when he passed, but their fear wasn't what unsettled him most. It was their eyes, always expecting something from him, something he could never give. Dinner time in the Rossi mansion was a ritual. Every night, a dozen chefs prepared the most exquisite dishes. Gold-trimmed plates, crystal glasses, imported wine, everything designed to please perfection itself. Yet no one could please him. He would sit at the head of the long mahogany table, a ghost among the living, his gaze fixed on the untouched food before him. One bite, maybe two, and the same thing every night. A slow sigh, a quiet shake of the head, and then silence. The chefs would exchange glances, their hearts sinking. No words of anger, no scenes of rage, only the quiet rejection that stung worse than shouting. It became a superstition among the staff. No meal could satisfy Adrian Rossi. No one knew why. Some said he had lost his sense of taste after a tragedy. Others believed he simply enjoyed control, a test of power over those who served him. But the truth was quieter, hidden behind eyes that carried too much loneliness. It was a Tuesday when Clara Bennett first stepped into the mansion. She wasn't supposed to be there at all. A waitress from a small cafe downtown, she had been hired as a temporary server for a private event. Her hands were steady, but her heart wasn't. She had never walked through doors guarded by men in black suits before. Inside, everything gleamed. Chandeliers like frozen waterfalls, polished marble floors reflecting every step. But Clara's eyes didn't linger on beauty. They caught the small details others missed. The faint scratch on a golden tray, the tired eyes of an old butler, the quiet, restless air around the place. When she entered the dining room, the tension hit her like perfume. Heavy, invisible, impossible to ignore. The chefs stood lined along the wall, their uniforms immaculate, their faces pale. The meal had been served, and at the head of the table sat him, Adrian Rossi. He didn't look up when she entered. He didn't have to. His presence filled the room like a shadow, calm, but commanding. His hand rested on the table, the watch on his wrist gleaming under the soft light. Before him, a plate of food sat untouched. She watched as he lifted the fork, brought a single bite to his lips, and paused. A faint wrinkle formed between his brows. Disappointment. Again. The fork lowered. The air froze. The head chef swallowed hard. "Is it not to your liking, sir?" Adrian's voice was low, deep, and disturbingly calm. No, just one word. Yet it echoed in the silence like thunder. The chef bowed slightly, his pride crumbling. The others waited, motionless. Clara stood by the door, clutching her tray, trying not to breathe too loudly. And yet, she saw something no one else did. A flicker in his eyes. A loneliness so quiet it almost begged not to be seen. When the dinner was over, the staff began to clear the table. Plates of untouched food disappeared one by one. Clara followed, her thoughts drifting. Why prepare so much beauty for someone who doesn't taste it? In the kitchen, chaos met silence. The chefs argued softly among themselves. "We've tried everything," one said. "Imported spices, rare wines, gold leaf garnish, nothing works. He just wants to humiliate us," another muttered. But Clara didn't believe that. She had served enough people to know when rejection came from pain, not arrogance. That night, as the others left, she lingered in the kitchen. The head chef was gone. The lights dimmed. On the counter lay a few leftover ingredients, tomatoes, herbs, a loaf of bread. Simple things. She smiled faintly to herself. Maybe he doesn't need luxury, she thought. Maybe he just needs something real. So she began to cook. Her hands moved gently. Not like a professional, but like someone who cooked for a memory. The scent of garlic filled the air, soft and familiar. She toasted the bread, added olive oil, and made a small bowl of rustic tomato soup. Nothing fancy, nothing worth a photograph, but it smelled like comfort. By the time she finished, the mansion had fallen quiet. She wasn't supposed to be there, but something told her not to leave yet. She placed the small dish on a tray and carried it to the dining hall. Adrian was still there, alone. He sat in the dim light, his tie loosened, his eyes lost in thought. For a moment he didn't notice her approach. When she set the tray before him, his gaze lifted, cold at first, then curious. "I made this," she said softly. "For you." He looked down at the simple bowl, no garnish, no gold. Just warmth. For a long moment he didn't move. Then, without a word, he lifted the spoon and tasted it. The silence that followed was heavier than sound. And then something changed. It was slight, a soft exhale, a flicker of surprise that melted the stillness in his eyes. The spoon paused halfway before returning for another bite. When he finally looked at her again, there was no anger, no command, only a question. "What is this?" She smiled. "Just soup." He looked down again, then back at her, and for the first time in a very long time, Adrian Rossi almost smiled. That night, no one knew what had happened. The mansion slept as usual, unaware that something had quietly shifted. Not in the empire, not in the city, but in one man's heart. And Clara Bennett, the girl who wasn't supposed to be there, had unknowingly done what no one else could. She had fed the hunger no one could name. Chapter 2. The Man Behind the Silence. The next morning, the mansion woke before the sun did. Footsteps echoed softly through long hallways, and the scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air. The staff whispered to one another, not about business, not about guests, but about him. Something strange had happened the night before. The heir, the untouchable Adrian Rossi, had eaten. Not just a bite. He had finished an entire dish. No one saw it happen, but the kitchen knew. The empty bowl was proof enough. The chefs examined it as if it were a relic. "Who made this?" one demanded. "It wasn't any of us." Then someone remembered the new girl. The quiet one with soft brown hair and nervous eyes. Clara. When she arrived that morning, she found herself at the center of every gaze. The head chef crossed his arms, both annoyed and curious. "You stayed late last night," he said. "Yes, sir. I was cleaning." He raised a brow. "And you cooked something." Her heart skipped. I just didn't want the food to go to waste." The chef stared for a moment longer, then sighed. "Whatever you did, it worked. Mr. Rossi actually ate it." The words made her blink. She hadn't expected him to even try it, let alone finish it. "He did?" she whispered. "Yes, but don't let it get to your head. He changes his mind faster than the wind." Clara smiled faintly, but deep down, something warm stirred, a tiny spark of hope. Later that afternoon, as sunlight poured through tall windows, Clara carried a tray of drinks through the main hall. The air was different today, not as heavy. Even the guards at the door seemed less tense. She was just passing the library when a voice stopped her. "Miss Bennett." Her steps froze. She turned. Adrian Rossi stood at the entrance. His black shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up, a softer image than the one she remembered from dinner. But his eyes were still the same, sharp, unreadable, deep as the night itself. He didn't speak at once. The silence stretched between them, long and delicate, like the pause before a confession. "You made something last night," he finally said. She nodded, her throat suddenly dry. "Yes, sir." "What was it?" "Tomato soup." His gaze lowered slightly, as if replaying the memory. It was different. Different bad? She asked, her voice trembling before she could stop it. He almost smiled, almost different good. The words were quiet, but they carried more weight than any praise he had ever given. Then, just as quickly, his expression returned to its calm reserve. Bring it again tonight. Clara blinked. You want me to cook for you? His eyes met hers. I want you to cook that. She nodded slowly, her pulse racing. Yes, Mr. Rossi. And just like that, she became the one person in the mansion with permission to serve him directly. That evening, she cooked again, the same way as before, from the heart, with the same simple ingredients. This time, she hummed softly as she worked. The kitchen was quiet around her. Even the chefs watched from a distance, curious and skeptical. When she carried the bowl to the dining room, he was already waiting. The room glowed under low chandeliers, the city lights flickering beyond tall glass windows. She placed the soup before him and stepped back. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he said softly, "Sit." Her eyes widened. "Sir." "Sit." He gestured to the chair across from him. She hesitated. Servants never sat with him. But something in his voice wasn't a command. It was a request. Gently, she obeyed. As he ate, she watched the flicker of candlelight reflect in his eyes. The world outside blurred away. The city, the noise, the danger that surrounded his name. Here it was only them. When he finished, he set the spoon down slowly. You cook like someone who remembers what hunger feels like, he said quietly. She met his gaze. Maybe that's the only way to cook honestly. A pause. Then a faint smile ghosted across his lips, so small she might have imagined it. You're not afraid of me, are you? Her voice was barely a whisper. No, sir. I just don't think you're as frightening as people say. For the first time in years, Adrian Rossi laughed, soft, quiet, disbelieving. It wasn't the laugh of a man used to joy. It was the sound of someone who had forgotten what it felt like. And for that brief, fragile moment, the silence between them was no longer empty. The days that followed slipped by quietly, like gentle pages turning in a book no one else could read. The mansion no longer felt as cold as before. The air carried the faint scent of herbs and toasted bread. Laughter occasionally escaped from the kitchen, something that hadn't happened in years. And every evening, as the city lights shimmered beyond the tall windows, Adrian Rossi would sit at the same table, and Clara Bennett would bring him something simple, warm, and real. It became their silent ritual. He never asked for elaborate dishes, and she never used recipes. She cooked by instinct, a handful of thyme, a drop of olive oil, a quiet hum while stirring the pot. And he, the man who had once rejected every flavor, ate in silence, watching her with the kind of attention that made words unnecessary. But what surprised her most wasn't his wealth or his calmness. It was how human he seemed when no one else was around. One evening, rain tapped gently against the windows. The sky outside was the color of silver smoke. Clara entered the dining room carrying a bowl of pasta and a small piece of bread she had baked herself. Adrian sat waiting, a book in his hand. When he looked up, she noticed the shadows beneath his eyes, the kind that didn't come from lack of sleep, but from too many thoughts. She placed the meal before him and smiled softly. Something simple again. He glanced at the food, then at her. You always say that, but nothing you make ever feels simple. Her cheeks warmed. I think food should comfort, not impress. He nodded slightly, his gaze lingering on her face for a second longer than usual. Then, as he tasted the first bite, his expression softened. Comfort, he murmured, almost to himself. I've forgotten what that word feels like. She hesitated. You don't have to forget it. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain. Then he spoke again, quietly, as if confessing to the rain outside. People think silence means peace, he said. But sometimes it's just loneliness, wearing a mask. Clara didn't know what to say. She wanted to reach across the table, to touch his hand, to tell him that she understood, that she, too, had known what it was to be alone in a crowded world. but she stayed still. Some hearts, she thought, were too fragile to be touched too soon. So instead, she whispered, "Maybe silence becomes softer when it's shared." He looked at her then, really looked. The kind of gaze that saw through walls and masks and titles. "You speak like someone who's lived a long time," he said quietly. "I just listen," she replied. "People tell you things when you do." Something flickered in his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite sadness. A kind of recognition. "Maybe that's why your food tastes different," he said. "You listen to it." She laughed softly. "I think it just listens back." The sound of her laughter, light, unguarded, filled the empty dining hall. Adrian watched her, something unspoken stirring within him. It wasn't just attraction. It was curiosity, warmth, maybe even hope, feelings he hadn't trusted in years. When dinner ended, he didn't dismiss her as usual. Instead, he stood and walked with her toward the kitchen. His steps were slow, unhurried. "You said you worked in a cafe," he said. "Yes, a small one, near the river." "And yet you're here." She shrugged lightly. "Life brings us to strange doors sometimes. I just happened to walk through this one." He glanced at her, a faint spark in his eyes, and changed everything inside it. Her breath caught for a moment. There was no flirtation in his voice, only quiet truth. When they reached the kitchen, he paused by the doorway. "Thank you," he said simply. She turned to him, surprised. "For what?" "For making this place feel alive again." He left before she could answer, his figure disappearing down the dim corridor. But even after he was gone, his words stayed, like a melody she couldn't stop hearing. That night, Clara stood by her small window in the servants' quarters, looking out over the rain-soaked city. Somewhere below, cars moved like fireflies in the mist. She thought of him, of the quiet behind his voice, the heaviness behind his calm. "What happened to you, Adrian Rossi?" She wondered. "What took the color out of your world?" She didn't know, but she wanted to find out. Not because he was powerful, not because he was the heir to a fortune, but because, behind his silence, she had seen something rare. A man who still wanted to feel alive. The rain lingered for 3 days. It fell softly over the city, washing the streets in silver light, whispering against the mansion's tall windows like a lullaby no one dared interrupt. Inside, time slowed. The world outside moved in chaos, business meetings, late-night phone calls, silent negotiations that shaped the city's underworld. But in the heart of the Rossi mansion, a quieter story was unfolding. Every evening, Adrian found himself waiting. He never admitted it, not even to himself, but his gaze always drifted toward the door a few minutes before dinner, toward her. And every evening she came, sometimes with soup, sometimes with bread, sometimes with something she had improvised entirely. A dish, she said, was made from memory. He never asked whose memory, but he always finished every bite. Between them, the silences grew softer. They had learned how to share them. One evening, the rain finally stopped. The air smelled of wet earth and jasmine from the garden below. Adrian sat near the window, a cup of coffee in his hand, when Clara entered carrying his dinner. He didn't look at the food this time. His eyes were on the city, its lights shimmering like tiny constellations. "Do you ever go out there?" she asked gently, setting the plate down. He shook his head. "Not anymore." "Why?" He sipped his coffee before answering. "Because every time I do, I see things I built and things I broke." There was no bitterness in his tone, only quiet honesty. Clara sat down across from him without asking this time. "Maybe you should see the things you've healed too," she said. He glanced at her, faint amusement in his eyes. "You think I've healed anything?" She smiled softly. "You've started eating again. That's a start." A low laugh escaped him, brief, but real. "You make it sound like I was starving." "Maybe not for food," she said. Her words hung between them, unguarded, trembling with truth. He didn't reply, but she saw the way his gaze softened, like a man seeing sunlight after too long in shadow. Later, after dinner, he walked her to the garden. The air was cool, the stone path still damp from rain. The roses glistened under the dim lights. "This place looks different at night," Clara whispered. "Everything does," he replied. "Night hides what the day refuses to forget." She turned to him, her hair brushing her cheek in the breeze. "And what do you try to forget?" For a moment he didn't answer. His jaw tightened slightly, his eyes drifting toward the horizon. "Too much," he said quietly. "And yet, nothing ever stays forgotten." They stood in silence for a while. The city below seemed far away, almost unreal. Then she noticed something she hadn't before. A small scar near his wrist, half hidden beneath his sleeve. Without thinking, she reached out, her fingertips brushing his skin. He froze. "I'm sorry," she whispered, pulling back. "I didn't mean to." He caught her hand gently. "It's all right." His touch was light, almost uncertain. For someone so powerful, he held her as if she might disappear. "It was a long time ago," he said. "A mistake." She looked up at him. "Everyone has one. Not everyone lives with it every day." The faint tremor in his voice was something she hadn't heard before. Not power, not control, but pain. A quiet, buried pain that had nowhere left to hide. Clara didn't try to comfort him with words. She simply stood beside him, their hands still lightly touching, and let the silence speak. When she finally returned inside, her heart was unsteady. She hadn't meant to get close to him, not like this. But the more time she spent near Adrian Rossi, the more she saw the man behind the myth. Not the heir, not the Mafia prince everyone feared. Just a man who had forgotten how to be loved. That night, as she lay in her small room, the echo of his quiet voice stayed with her. Night hides what the day refuses to forget. She wondered what memories he kept locked behind that silence, and whether, someday, he would trust her enough to share them.
The mansion was a world of its own, too large for one man, too silent for a home. Even after weeks there, Clara still found new corridors that led to nowhere, rooms that seemed forgotten by time. Sometimes she walked them just to hear her footsteps, the faint rhythm of proof that she was real in a place that often felt like a dream. One afternoon, she wandered farther than usual. The sky outside was bright, and the golden light spilled through the tall windows, turning the dust in the air into tiny stars. As she passed a closed set of double doors, a faint scent of cedar and something older, polish, maybe memories, reached her. The handle was cold under her fingers. She hesitated, then pushed. The door opened with a low sigh. Inside was a music room. It was wide and empty except for one thing, an old grand piano standing in the center, its black surface dimmed by time. Dust had gathered on the keys. But somehow, even in stillness, the instrument seemed alive, as if it had been waiting. Clara stepped closer, her heart beating quietly in her chest. She brushed her fingertips across the lid, leaving a pale trail through the dust. Then, almost without thinking, she pressed one key. A single note filled the air. Soft. Hollow. Lonely. It echoed through the room like a sigh that had been waiting years to be heard. She smiled faintly and pressed another. And another. The melody that came wasn't perfect, just a few scattered notes, hesitant, searching. But as she played, something in the silence began to shift. Behind her, a voice said, "No one has touched that piano in 10 years." She turned sharply. Adrian stood at the doorway, his expression unreadable, a shadow against the light. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to intrude." He raised a hand slightly. "It's all right." His eyes drifted to the piano. For a long moment, he said nothing. Just looked at it the way one looks at an old photograph, with both tenderness and pain. Then he walked closer, his footsteps soft on the carpeted floor. "My mother used to play," he said quietly. The first light brushed over the mansion like a whisper, pale gold seeping through tall windows, sliding across marble floors and half-open doors. The house, usually so heavy with quiet, seemed lighter that day, as if even its walls could sense the change in its master's heart. Clara woke earlier than usual. She didn't know why. Perhaps it was habit now, or maybe it was because she had dreamt of the piano room again, of Adrian standing by the window, sunlight painting his face with fragile warmth. She dressed quickly and made her way to the kitchen, humming under her breath. The melody was one she'd played for him, soft, unfinished, a promise left hanging in the air. By the time breakfast was ready, the house had begun to stir. She arranged the tray carefully: black coffee, buttered toast, and something new, honeyed figs with cream. When she entered his study, Adrian was already awake, though the papers before him looked untouched. He glanced up, his expression unreadable but gentler somehow. "You're early," he said. "So are you," she replied, placing the tray down. He nodded toward the plate. "That's new. I thought you might like something sweet for once." He gave a faint, skeptical smile. "I don't usually." "I know," she said, her tone light. "But try anyway." He hesitated, then picked up a fork. The first bite was small, cautious, like a man testing a bridge before crossing it. Then something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of surprise that almost made her laugh. "It's good," he admitted. "Good?" she teased. "Or actually good?" He exhaled, a low, amused sound that wasn't quite laughter but close. "Actually good." Clara smiled, not proudly, but quietly, as if that small word was worth more than any praise. For a moment, neither spoke. The sunlight fell across his desk, warming the dark wood, catching faint glimmers in his hair. His sleeves were rolled up, his tie hung loose. For once, he didn't look like the untouchable man everyone in the city feared, just someone human, almost ordinary, almost free. She said softly, "You look different today." He raised an eyebrow. "Different ho?" "Lighter," she said. He studied her face for a long moment, as though deciding whether she meant it. Then he said, "Maybe I just slept." But she knew it wasn't that. It was something else, the way he had let her into his past. The way he had started, however quietly, to trust her. When she turned to leave, he stopped her. "Clara." She faced him again. "Tonight," he said. "Dinner. In the garden." She blinked, uncertain she'd heard correctly. "Dinner." He nodded once. "You cook. I'll join you." A faint smile touched her lips. "As you wish, Mr. Rossi." "Adrian," he said. "The word hung between them like a spark catching air." She hesitated, then repeated softly, "Adrian." It was the first time she'd ever said his name. And somehow, it changed everything. That evening, the garden shimmered beneath a sky painted in dusk and gold. Clara had set a small table near the fountain. Candles flickering in the breeze. The scent of rosemary and lemon drifted from the plates she'd prepared. Simple dishes, but made with care. Adrian arrived quietly. Dressed not in his usual black suit but in a white shirt, open at the collar. He looked almost unreal in the candlelight, not as the man the city whispered about, but as someone who belonged to the night itself. "This is beautiful," he said softly. "It's just dinner," she replied. He shook his head. "No. It's more than that." They sat. The first few minutes were quiet. The kind of silence that trembles on the edge of something unspoken. Then he said, "Do you ever miss the city?" She looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" "You're here most of the time now. You used to talk about walking through markets, the noise, the crowds. Don't you miss it?" Clara smiled faintly. "Sometimes. But noise isn't the same as life. There's more life in silence, if you know where to listen." He considered that, then said, "You talk like Somione vos livet wisse." "Maybe I've just listened twice," she answered. He laughed, a real one this time, quiet but unguarded. It was the kind of sound that filled the garden more beautifully than music ever could. For the first time in years, Adrian Rossi laughed. And for the first time in her life, Clara felt that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The candles wavered in the evening breeze, their light dancing across Adrian's face, tracing the line of his jaw, the quiet curve of his mouth when he smiled. The garden had fallen almost completely silent, except for the sound of the fountain and the faint rustle of the trees. Somewhere beyond the walls, the city glowed in its restless rhythm, but here, in this small corner of the world, time had slowed. Clara poured wine into his glass, careful not to spill. "It feels strange," she said. "What does?" "Seeing you out here, not behind that big desk of yours. You look," she paused, searching for the right word. "Free." He studied her for a moment, then smiled softly. "You make it sound like I've been in prison." "Haven't you?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted toward the fountain. "Where the water shimmered under the candles." "Maybe," he said at last. "A quiet one. The kind you built for yourself." She nodded slowly. "Sometimes those are the hardest to escape." He looked at her again, really looked, the calm strength in her eyes, the warmth that seemed to draw light toward her. "And what about you?" he asked. "What are you escaping from?" Clara hesitated. The question lingered in the air like the faint smoke from the candles. "I guess," she said finally, "I was escaping from being invisible." He frowned slightly, as though that thought didn't fit her.
Invisible. I uset to move trug the city.
And no one ever really saw me.
Just another face in the crowd, another name no one rememberet.
But here, she paused, her voice softening. Here I feel seen. He leaned back, his expression unreadable, yet his eyes carried something fragile, like understanding. "You are seen, Clara," he said quietly. "More than you think." The words lingered between them, gentle yet powerful, like a secret being set free. For a long while, neither spoke. The night deepened, the candles burned lower. Then Adrian said, almost to himself, "I don't know when it happened, when the silence stopped feeling safe." She tilted her head. "Safe." 4 years, silence was how I survived, he said. Noise meant danger. Conversations meant risk. But lately, he trailed off, looking toward her again. Lately it feels like silence is louder than ever, because you're not in it.
Claras Brit kaukt.
The words weren't a confession, not exactly. But they were something deeper, an opening small and trembling, like the first crack of dawn through a long night. "Adrian," she whispered, unsure what to say. He smiled faintly. "You don't have to answer." But she wanted to. She wanted to tell him that she understood. That she too had begun to feel something she couldn't name. Something that warmed her from the inside out, something that frightened her because it felt like hope. Instead, she said, "Maybe the silence isn't gone. Maybe it's just changing." He nodded slowly. "Maybe." The breeze picked up again, stirring the candlelight. For a moment, Clara thought the night might swallow the moment whole, that this fragile connection between them might fade like smoke. But then Adrian reached across the table and took her hand. It was a small gesture, tentative. Almost uncertain, but the warmth of it spread through her like sunlight through glass. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The world around them seemed to fall away, leaving only the quiet rhythm of two hearts finding the courage to be heard.
Wen the last candle flickered out.
He said softly, "Thank you."
For what? For reminding me what light tastes like.
The days that followed were softer somehow.
It wasn't something that could be measured, not in words, or gestures, or moments. It was in the air itself. The way the halls of the mansion no longer felt so cold. The way sunlight lingered longer on the windows. The way silence no longer carried the same weight. Something in Adrian had begun to change. He still worked late into the night, still moved with the same precise calm that made others hesitate to approach him. But now, there were pauses, small, human pauses. He would stop in the kitchen on his way to the study, not to give orders, but to ask, "What are you cooking today?" He would linger near the garden in the evenings, standing quietly as Clara watered the plants, saying nothing, but always staying until she finished. And sometimes, when she played the piano, he would come to the doorway and just listen. No words, no requests, just the sound of music filling spaces that had once belonged to ghosts. It was in these small, unspoken things that Clara saw the truth. He was learning how to live again. One evening, as she arranged dinner in the dining room, she noticed something unusual. On the table, beside her usual place setting, was a small crystal vase holding a single white lily. It hadn't been there before. She looked around. The house was quiet, the staff gone for the evening. Adrian's study door was half open down the corridor, light spilling across the floor. When she carried his plate in, he didn't look up immediately. He was writing, his expression focused, a faint crease between his brows. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said softly. "You never do," he replied without hesitation, setting his pen aside. She smiled faintly, glancing toward the lily. "You brought a flower to the table." He looked up at her, eyes calm, but there was warmth in them now. "You said once that this house needed something alive." Her smile deepened. "You remembered." "I remember more than you think," he said. For a moment, her chest tightened, not with fear, but with something gentler, deeper. She could feel the shift between them, slow and inevitable, like the turning of seasons. They ate quietly after that. She told him about a recipe she had learned from her grandmother. He listened with the kind of attention that made her feel like her words mattered. and when he spoke, rarely, but with care, she found herself memorizing the sound of his voice, the way it softened when he wasn't trying to command the world. After dinner, she stood by the window, watching the city lights below. Adrian joined her, his presence steady beside hers. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked quietly. She turned to him. "Leaving where?" "Here," he said. "The mansion." "Me?" Clara blinked, surprised. "Why would I?" He gave a faint, almost sad smile. "People do, eventually." She studied his face for a long moment, the strength there, the loneliness he still carried like a shadow. "Not everyone leaves, Adrian," she said softly. "Some of us stay because we want to." He looked at her then, and something in his expression shifted. A crack in the armor, a flicker of emotion he couldn't hide. "Clara," he said, her name sounding different on his lips, lower, gentler. "You should know something." Her heart skipped. "What is it?" He hesitated. The kind of hesitation that comes before truth. "You've changed this place. You've changed me." She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She didn't need them. He stepped closer, just enough for her to feel his breath against her hair. "Before you," he said quietly, "I thought peace was something I'd buried with my past, but now I hear it again. Every time you walk into a room." The words were soft, but they carried a weight that made her heart tremble. She turned to face him, and for a long moment, they simply stood there, not touching, but impossibly close. The air between them was warm, electric, alive with everything they hadn't said. The fountain outside whispered. The candles flickered in the wind, and time itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, almost imperceptibly, Adrian reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise. It was simply a beginning. Chapter 5. The Language of Touch. Morning returned like a promise. The rain that had lingered 4 days was gone, leaving the sky washed clean, pale and endless. The mansion breathed again, windows open, curtains moving softly with the breeze, the scent of earth and roses drifting in. Clara walked through the halls with a quiet energy she hadn't felt in months. Every sound, the creak of a floorboard, the distant ticking of a clock, felt alive, as though the house itself had begun to listen. She found Adrian in the garden, standing by the fountain where they'd once dined. He wasn't dressed in the usual armor of business. His sleeves were rolled, his hair slightly undone. For a man who lived behind walls, he looked almost reachable. "You're up early," she said. He turned, and the sunlight caught the edge of a smile. "Couldn't sleep. Bad dreams?" He shook his head. "No, just too much peace. I'm not used to it." Clara laughed softly, setting a tray on the stone ledge. "Then maybe I'll help you get used to it." He raised an eyebrow. "With coffee?" "With company," she said. He watched her for a moment, then nodded. "I'll allow it." They sat together by the fountain, sipping quietly as the water murmured between them. Neither filled the silence. They didn't have to. It had changed. No longer heavy, but gentle, like the pause before a note in music. Adrian glanced at her hands, resting lightly on the cup. "You play the piano differently now," he said. "How so?" "Before, it sounded like you were trying to wake the house. Now, it sounds like you're talking to it." She smiled. Maybe it finally started listening. He looked at her, the faintest trace of warmth in his eyes. "Maybe I did." The words hung in the air, unguarded, fragile. Clara felt her breath catch, not from surprise, but from the quiet truth of it. Later that afternoon, she found him in the study again. But this time, he wasn't reading or working. He was painting. A single canvas rested on an easel near the window. Broad strokes of grey and gold, half finished, abstract yet somehow full of feeling. "I didn't know you painted," she said, stepping closer. He didn't turn. "I used to. Stopped years ago." "What made you start again?" His brush paused midair. "You did." She blinked. "Me." He nodded once. "When you play, I see colors again." The confession was simple, but something inside her shifted. She had never imagined that her presence could echo this way, through his hands, his art, his silence. She moved closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's beautiful." He set the brush down and finally looked at her. "It isn't finished." "Neither are we," she said before she could stop herself. The room fell utterly quiet. Then, slowly, his hand rose, hesitant, searching, and he brushed a streak of paint from her cheek that wasn't there. His fingers lingered, just long enough for her to feel the tremor beneath his comb. "Clara," he whispered. She didn't step back. "I know." No more words followed. They didn't need them. The language between them had shifted into something wordless. The kind of touch that said, "I see you. I hear you. I'm still here." The days slipped by like pages turning in a slow, patient story. Nothing grand happened. No declarations. No sudden turns. And yet everything was changing. There were mornings when Clara found fresh flowers in the kitchen, always in simple vases, always placed where she would see them first. There were evenings when Adrian returned from meetings with that quiet exhaustion in his eyes, and she would brew tea without asking. He never said thank you aloud, but the way he held the cup, with both hands, as if grounding himself, was enough. They had found a rhythm. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. Sometimes, he would stand in the doorway as she played the piano, not speaking, just listening. Sometimes, she would feel his gaze and falter, her fingers slipping, and he would smile, small but real, like a secret between them. One evening, rain returned, gentle, unhurried, the kind of rain that belonged to quiet thoughts. Clara stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself, watching the drops trail down the glass. The garden shimmered in the storm, the fountain blurred into rippling circles of light. Adrian's reflection appeared beside hers. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked softly. "Miss what?" "The noise, the world outside these walls." She thought for a moment. "Sometimes, but then I remember that peace isn't silence. It's choosing who you share the quiet with." He looked at her then, really looked. The kind of gaze that doesn't just see, but understands. "Clara," he said quietly, "you make this house feel alive." She smiled faintly. "And you make it feel safe." For a long time, they simply stood there, shoulder to shoulder, listening to the rain. And then, without thinking, she reached for his hand. It wasn't planned, just instinct, the way you might reach for warmth in the dark. Her fingers brushed against his, uncertain, trembling slightly. Adrian didn't move, for a heartbeat. She thought she had gone too far, but then his hand turned, slowly, his fingers threading through hers. It was the simplest thing, and yet it felt like the whole world shifted. His hand was warm, solid, alive, a silent vow. They stayed like that, watching the rain together. The sound of it filled the room, soft, rhythmic, endless. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost lost to the storm. "I used to hate the rain," he said. "It reminded me of endings. And now," he looked at her, his thumb brushing lightly against her hand, "now it feels like a beginning." Clara smiled, though her eyes shimmered. "Maybe it always was." He didn't answer, but his silence said more than words ever could. Because love, the real kind, the kind that heals, doesn't rush. It lingers, it listens, it learns the language of stillness. And on that rain-washed night, the quiet between them spoke louder than any confession. The rain stopped just before dawn. By the time sunlight reached the city, the streets shimmered, silver, clean, alive again. For the first time in weeks, Adrian suggested leaving the mansion. Clara blinked in surprise when he asked, "Now, you?" He smiled, faint and shy. "I think the world might still remember me." She laughed softly. "It never forgot you. You just forgot how to meet it halfway." He paused, as though turning the idea over. Then he nodded. "Then maybe you can show me how." They walked through the city, like two people rediscovering what it meant to be. Adrian moved slowly, his eyes taking in every detail. The sound of laughter from a nearby cafe, the smell of roasted coffee, the way sunlight touched the wet pavement. Clara kept close, watching his face soften, his shoulders loosen. "This used to terrify me," he said quietly, stopping by a street musician, playing violin beneath a tree. "What did?" "People," he said simply. "Noise, life." She smiled. "And now?" He watched the musician's fingers dance over the strings. "Now it sounds like forgiveness." They stood there for a while, listening. The music rose and fell like breathing, imperfect, human, alive. When the song ended, Adrian reached into his pocket and dropped a folded bill into the violin case. The musician looked up and smiled, and Adrian smiled back, a real one this time, unguarded, almost boyish. Clara's heart softened. She had never seen him look so light. Later, they found a small cafe, tucked between two flower shops, a quiet corner of the world, filled with the scent of fresh bread and coffee. They sat by the window. Adrian stirred his drink absent-mindedly, eyes on the street. "You used to come here?" Clara asked. "Once," he said, "years ago, when everything still felt possible." She tilted her head. "And now?" He turned to her, meeting her gaze. "Now it feels real again." The words hit her like a heartbeat. She felt her chest tighten, not in pain, but in recognition. For a long moment, they simply watched each other, the world moving quietly beyond the glass. On their way back, the sky turned soft and gold. The streets glowed, the city humming in low rhythm around them. Clara walked a step ahead, and Adrian followed, not because he was lost, but because he had finally stopped leading. At a crosswalk, she turned back. "You okay?" He nodded, his eyes gentle. "I think I'm starting to be." Then, without thinking, he reached out, brushing his fingers against hers in the open air. Right there among strangers, noise and light. It was such a small thing, almost invisible, but to them, it was everything. No more hiding behind silence, no more running from the world. Just a man and a woman, walking side by side through a city that suddenly felt like home. That night, back at the mansion, Clara stood in the garden again. The fountain whispered softly. The stars hung low. She felt him before she saw him. That quiet presence that no longer frightened her. Did it feel strange? She asked. Adrian's voice came from behind her. No, it felt right. She turned, smiling faintly. "You see, the world didn't forget you." He stepped closer, his expression thoughtful. "No, but I think I needed someone to remind me that I hadn't forgotten myself." The words caught her off guard. She looked up, her breath slowing, the space between them small enough to feel his warmth. "Adrian," she whispered, "you're changing." He smiled, soft, real. "Maybe I'm just remembering who I was before the silence." And when he took her hand again, this time it wasn't hesitant, it was certain, because love, she realized, wasn't something that rescued you. It was something that reminded you how to live. Chapter 6. The distance between heartbeats. It started with a letter, not a dramatic one, just a thin, cream-colored envelope resting on Adrian's desk one morning. Among his usual papers and reports, the handwriting was precise, formal, nothing remarkable, but the seal on the back, gold and embossed with a familiar crest, made his pulse slow. Clara found him there, standing still, the letter unopened in his hand. "Bad news?" she asked softly. He didn't look up right away. "Not bad," he said, "just unexpected." When he finally opened it, his eyes scanned the page slowly, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he set it down. "It's from the board," he said. "They want me to return to the city office, to everything I walked away from." Clara felt her breath catch. "I thought you were done with that life." "So did I." Silence stretched between them, delicate, uncertain. He turned toward the window, the morning light tracing the sharp lines of his face. "It's strange," he said. "The world feels quiet for the first time, and yet it's calling me back." Clara's voice trembled just slightly. "And will you go?" He didn't answer, but the look in his eyes told her he didn't know. That night, the mansion felt heavier again, the kind of heaviness that comes from unspoken things. Adrian worked late in the study. The door was open, as it always was now, but he didn't look up when Clara passed. She paused in the doorway, watching him, the old pasture, the stillness, the return of the distance she had once fought to erase. "Don't stay up too late," she said softly. He nodded without looking up. "I'll try." She lingered for a heartbeat longer, wanting to say more. to reach across the space between them, but instead, she turned away. The sound of rain returned that night. It should have been peaceful, but it wasn't. It felt like memory. Days passed. He grew quieter. She smiled less. The small things, the flowers on the kitchen table, the shared breakfasts, the soft laughter, began to fade like photographs left in the sun. One afternoon, she stood by the piano, tracing her fingers over the keys without playing. Adrian appeared in the doorway. "I miss the music," he said quietly. She looked up, startled. "Then why does it feel like you're the one who stopped hearing it?" He hesitated. "Clara, don't," she said, shaking her head. "Don't apologize. Just tell me what you want." He stepped closer, the air between them heavy with everything unsaid. "I don't know what I want. That's the problem." Her voice softened. "Then maybe that's what you need to find out." He closed his eyes, as if the truth hurt. "You make it sound so simple." "It isn't," she whispered. "But neither is love." When he opened his eyes again, she saw something raw there, fear, maybe, or longing, or both. And for the first time since they met, he looked uncertain not of himself, but of her. "Will you wait?" he asked quietly. She blinked. "For what?" "For me to figure out who I am." She smiled, though her heart ached. "I already know who you are, Adrian. I just don't know if you do." That night, the mansion felt different again. Not empty, not cold, but suspended, like the air between two heartbeats. And in that stillness, Clara realized something. Sometimes, love doesn't fade because of distance. It fades because of silence. The days began to separate them, quietly, not through arguments or anger, but through the slow drift of two hearts afraid to speak. Adrian worked long hours again. The office downtown pulled him back, little by little, with its meetings, its calls, its old rhythm. The mansion, the place that once felt alive, began to echo with absence. Clara noticed it first in the mornings, the untouched coffee cup, the empty chair at breakfast, the quiet that came not from peace, but from missing. She tried not to let it ache. She played the piano, tended the garden, filled her hours with the small routines that had once healed her. But every song she played sounded unfinished now, like a letter waiting for an answer. One evening, she found him in the study again, his back to the door, the light from the desk lamp carving shadows across his shoulders. "You're home late," she said softly. He didn't turn. "There was work. There's always work." "I didn't mean for it to be this way." "Neither did I." The silence that followed was not angry, just fragile. She stepped closer, the scent of rain and ink filling the air between them. "You said once that you didn't want to live in the past anymore." "I remember." "Then why are you walking back into it?" Adrian's hands stilled over the papers. He closed his eyes. "Because it's what I know. It's where I'm needed." "And what about here?" she asked quietly. "Are you needed here?" He turned at last, his eyes meeting hers. Weary, searching, full of something she couldn't name. "Yes," he said, "more than I can explain." "Then explain anyway." He rose from his chair, crossing the space between them. "You don't understand," he said. "Everything I built, everything I lost, it's all tied to that world. If I walk away completely, I lose what's left of who I was." Clara met his gaze steadily. "Maybe that's what you need to lose." The words landed like truth, soft, but unflinching. He looked at her for a long time, as though trying to memorize her face. "You make it sound easy." She smiled softly. "It's not. But love never asks for easy, Adrian. It asks for real." He stood there, caught between two worlds, the one that demanded him, and the one that waited for him. And in that moment, Clara understood something quietly devastating. She could love him with her whole heart, and still not be able to save him from himself. That night, she went to the garden alone. The moon was low, the fountain still, the same place where he had once told her that silence wasn't safe anymore. Now, the silence had returned, not dangerous, just empty. She closed her eyes, whispering to the wind, "Don't let this be the end of us, not yet." But the wind gave no answer. Meanwhile, in the study, Adrian sat in the dark long after the lamp had gone out. The unopened letter lay beside him. Another offer, another meeting, another world that wanted him back. He thought of Clara's hands, her voice, the way she saw him when he couldn't see himself. And for the first time, he wondered if leaving wasn't about walking away from her, but walking away from who he used to be. The morning came quietly. Grey light spilled through the windows, soft and cold, like a memory that refused to fade. Clara moved through the mansion in silence. She watered the plants, opened the curtains, set 2 cups of coffee on the table, the same as every morning. Only one would be touched. She didn't cry, not yet, but something inside her had begun to settle. A strange calm, the kind that comes when you finally stop fighting what you can't control. Adrian had left before sunrise again. A note lay folded on the counter. Had to meet someone. Don't wait up. She read it twice, then placed it neatly beside the untouched cup. The letters were precise, distant, the kind of handwriting that belonged to a man who was trying not to feel too much. At noon, the rain returned, soft, relentless. Clara stood by the window, watching it trace patterns across the glass. She thought of the first time they stood there together. The silence between them then had been warm. Now, it was only waiting. And then, footsteps. She turned. Adrian stood in the doorway, his hair damp, his coat dark with rain. There was something in his eyes she hadn't seen in weeks. Exhaustion, yes, but beneath it, something raw. "You're home early," she said quietly. "I didn't go," he answered. She frowned. Didn't go where? To the meeting? To the office? To any of it? Clara froze. He stepped closer. The air between them charged, trembling. "I drove halfway there," he said, his voice low. "But then I realized something. I wasn't leaving for them. I was running away from you." Her breath caught. "Adrian, I thought I could live between both worlds, the man I was and the man I'm becoming. But I can't. Every time I try, I lose one of them, and I'm done losing." The rain whispered against the windows like applause too soft to hear. Clara swallowed hard. "You don't have to prove anything to me." He shook his head. "It's not about proving. It's about choosing." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter, now creased. DAMP, torn at the edges. He placed it on the table between them. "I'm not going back," he said simply. For a long time, she didn't move. She just looked at him. This man who had spent so long building walls, now standing with his heart completely unguarded. "Why?" she whispered. Adrian's answer was quiet but steady. "Because when I picture my future, Clara, it doesn't look like a boardroom. It looks like you, standing in this room, waiting for me to come home." Her hand flew to her mouth. He stepped closer, his voice trembling slightly. "You once told me that love doesn't ask for easy. You were right. But it also doesn't wait forever. I can't ask you to keep waiting for a man who's only half here. So I'm here now. All of me." Clara's eyes shimmered. "You're sure?" He nodded. For the first time in years, she let out a soft, shaky laugh. I was so afraid you'd choose the world again. Adrian smiled, tired, tender. The world is still out there, but it's quieter now, because you're my sound. And when he stepped forward, she didn't step back. Their hands met, the same quiet gesture that had once begun everything. And this time, it didn't feel like uncertainty. It felt like home. No grand declarations, no promises, just the distance between two heartbeats, closing at last. That night, they sat by the piano together. Clara played softly, her fingers finding the melody he had always loved. Adrian rested his hand over hers, guiding the notes, not correcting, just joining. The song they played had no name. It didn't need one, because some love stories aren't written in words. They're written in moments, in the quiet, in the rain, in the way two souls finally stop running. Chapter 7: The Quiet Forever. The city was quiet again. Not the kind of quiet that comes from absence, but the kind that grows when two lives finally fall into rhythm, steady, unhurried, alive. Weeks passed softly. The world outside continued to turn. Meetings held, cars rushing, lights flickering. But inside the mansion, time had slowed to something tender. The house was no longer haunted. The echoes were filled with laughter now, faint, unplanned, real. Sometimes Clara would hum as she moved through the rooms, and Adrian would follow the sound, pretending not to. He would pause in the doorway, pretending to search for a file or a book, but his eyes would always find her first, and she always noticed. Looking for something, she would ask. He would smile, small and secretive. Found it. One morning, sunlight broke across the garden like a blessing. Clara was kneeling by the fountain, replanting the lily that had wilted after the last rain. Adrian stood at the balcony above, coffee in hand, watching her. He didn't call out. He just let himself watch. The movement of her hands, the quiet patience in her gestures. It struck him then how much of life he had missed while chasing everything else. He walked down to her. "You'll ruin your clothes," he said softly. She looked up, smiling. "Then I'll wash them." Simple. Adrian crouched beside her, the morning light reflecting in his eyes. "You always make it sound simple." Clara brushed her hair from her face, leaving a trace of soil on her cheek. "Maybe it is," she said. "Maybe love isn't supposed to be complicated. Maybe it's just the people deciding to stay." He looked at her for a long moment. "Stay," he repeated. She nodded. "Even when it's quiet." Especially then. Later that evening, they sat by the piano. Clara's fingers drifted across the keys. The melody was soft, like the pulse of the night. Adrian listened, eyes half closed. When she stopped, he didn't speak. She turned to him. "What are you thinking?" He smiled faintly. "That every sound I used to fear has turned into something beautiful. Even silence." He nodded. "Especially silence." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and the room filled with the sound of their breathing, steady, synchronized, a rhythm all its own. Outside, the fountain whispered. The city hummed faintly beyond the hills. The stars blinked awake, slow and deliberate, and for the first time, there was no distance between their heartbeats. Weeks later, Clara found a small notebook on the table, plain leather, bound with a ribbon. Inside, page after page of sketches, the mansion, the garden, her hands on the piano, her hair caught in sunlight. At the very back, one line written in Adrian's careful handwriting. "I thought silence was my home, but then I heard your voice, and now the quiet belongs to us." That night, she found him in the garden. The air smelled of earth and rain, and something timeless. That night, she found him in the garden. The air smelled of earth and rain, and something timeless. You wrote this, she said, holding the notebook close. I did. It's beautiful. He smiled softly. So are you. She laughed. That small, unguarded laugh he loved most, and leaned into him. Neither spoke again. They didn't need to, because love had finally settled into what it was always meant to be. Not loud, not fleeting, but quiet, and forever.